Welcome to Our Weird World. I'm your host, John Henson, and today we are not celebrating, we're recognizing Black History Month with some more episodes on race riots. You can check out episode number 144 for the first part of this series, I guess. And look, here's the thing. Some of you might find it, some of you uptight white people might find it a little distressing that I'm having a Black History Month episodes, but it's going to be around race riots in which black people just get absolutely massacred. And it's not, here's the thing. I can see how maybe on paper, there's kind of like this reverse, like, we're actually celebrating it down with the blackies. No, that's not it. All right. That's not it. See, I did, I think maybe it was the first year of this show. I did a Black History Month episode where all of the people in the stories were, black characters or they're such. And I didn't do it for the last couple of years because here's the thing. Not because I don't want to recognize black people by any means, but one, most of the stories that are documented and that just happen, mostly white people. All right. And here's the thing. Black people in America take up about 12% of the population. So, at most, if we're going to be equitable, all right, if we're going to be equal, if we're going to be just, then only 12% of these podcast stories should even be about black people in the first place. I'm probably not at the 12% mark, but also just because, look, here's the thing. All right. Here's the thing. Black people aren't that bad. All right. This show is all about the weird and the heinous and the bad, and black people, they're not that bad. All right. It's white people that are the worst, but black people, they're just like, yeah, we were slaves and that's it. And then there's been a couple bad apples here and there, but for the most part, it's that they've been doing their thing, winning NBA championships and Super Bowls and such, because they're really good athletes. Like, God, they're good at sports. But anyway, this is that moment in the monologue where I've kind of backed myself into a corner, but then I also haven't, because I haven't said anything that's factually inaccurate yet. So we've got 3 stories today. We're just going to seamlessly segue into that. Arthur McDuffie, the Perry, Florida race riot, and our first story will be of the Wilmington Insurrection. During the Reconstruction period following the Civil War, Wilmington, North Carolina had become actually the largest city in the state, mostly thanks to Union occupation of the port during the Civil War. Large numbers of freed slaves then migrated to Wilmington and actually began building up the city. By the end of the war, black people held a majority of the city's population. So in the election of 1898, we're some 30 years or so removed from the Civil War. After spending the previous election cycle since 1875 swapping control between the Republicans and populists, the Democratic Party, who were the racist people at the time, they actually won the majority of the elections and took control of the state legislature by basically running a campaign based on white supremacy and fears of black men taking and impregnating all of the white women. This was spurred by a group called the Red Shirts, and you can just take a wild guess how they got that name, who went around disrupting Republican and black community meetings in an attempt to basically just scare people and prevent them from voting for more reasonable and not racist candidates. Well, after the 1898 election, white supremacists led by Alfred Moore Waddell created the Committee of 25 and presented a series of demands to the Committee of Colored Citizens. One of the demands was to evict Alexander Manley and his brother Frank, who were owners of the Daily Record, the only black-owned newspaper in the state. The Committee of 25 then gave the Committee of Colored Citizens until November 10th to respond, but they never did because that's a silly thing to respond to. So at 8 a.m. on November 10th, Waddell and an army of as many as 1,500 men marched to the Daily Record office in Wilmington and just burned the entire building down, which probably easy to do in a place that manufactures newspapers. And then because angry white people have this weird fascination with fire, the group quickly transformed into an angry mob, grew to as many as 2,000 men, and then just started going through the entire city of Wilmington, attacking and shooting any black family that they came across. A guy named Walker Taylor, who had been part of another racist committee created by Waddell, was ordered by the governor to take the Wilmington Light Infantry into town and stop the violence. Well, this infantry, who had just come back from the Spanish-American War, marched through town, and they're not on anybody's sides. They're intimidating black people. They're intimidating white people. They've got these new fancy rapid-fire weapons. Mostly, they figured out they could really just join in on the racism. They killed several more black people along the way and eventually kind of took the side of the whites. In the end, somewhere between 6 and 100 black men were killed because record keeping wasn't a big deal back then. Over 2,100 black families or black people permanently moved away from Wilmington after this event. The mob then went on to force Mayor Silas P. Wright, a white man, and several members of the city government to resign. Waddell, who had been leading this mob, then took over as mayor by the end of the day. Wilmington's residents who didn't evacuate then pleaded with President William McKinley for help, but were told that nothing could be done without a formal request from the state's governor. Well, obviously that never came. In the following years, the Democratic-controlled legislature passed a bunch of voting laws to exclude blacks and poor white people by requiring a poll tax and passing a literacy test, which was often administered by a rich, racist white person in order to vote. And that's an important detail because that goes to show you, even today, it's not about race. A lot of this started to be about race, but in the end and overall, it's about poor people because all of the black people, I don't say all of them, but the vast majority of the black people were also poor and illiterate. And so those groups of people were all going to vote the same anyway, right? The poor white people, of which there are plenty in Eastern North Carolina, they're going to vote for more government assistance and lower tax, all that kind of stuff to that the Democrats at the time, or the populists, they were going to be trying to do. And so they were trying to get more restriction and all that. And so the black people, the poor white people, they wanted a more liberal government. They weren't going to get it because these people came into power. So really, guys, it's what it's all about. All right. It's the rich versus the poor. And there's this, they oftentimes they'll dangle this ornament of racism to distract you from, I'm getting real conspiracy laden right now, and I don't intend to be, but open your eyes, bro. Anyway, you get it. The Democratic-controlled legislature also went on to pass segregation, Jim Crow, and martial laws against black people in North Carolina. And these laws stayed in place for more than 60 years until the civil rights movement occurred, and all of them were, obviously repealed. A short story here for our second one. In 1922, Ruby Hendry, a white school teacher, was murdered by a guy named Charles Wright, who just so happened to be black. And guess what, guys? Ruby, she was a little white girl. All right. In this country, we love it when a white girl gets murdered because, oh, God, I'm surprised. Netflix will make a documentary about this if they haven't done so yet. They've still got to get through all of the current white women who have been murdered. They'll get to this one eventually, probably. It also didn't help that Charles Wright was an escaped convict, but he was quickly seized by an angry white mob, as if there are any other kind, and made up of several thousand people from local and out-of-state areas in the small town of Perry, Florida, which is probably kind of in the Tallahassee-ish area. Like, it's not like super close to Tallahassee, but like in that general part of Florida. Wright was then tortured until he confessed to the murder, and then he was burned at the stake like he was a witch. This is 1922. All right. And because an angry white mob can't stop at one murder, they then found and shot and hanged 2 more men. They burned down the black schoolhouse in Perry. They also burned down the Masonic Lodge, a church, and several families' homes. And that's just about it. Like, everything just kind of went back to normal at that point. I mean, there were other massacres like happening in Florida, by the way. You don't think of it as a hotbed of racial tension, at least between like white people and black people. Maybe there's some stuff going on with Hispanics. I don't know. But like, so many like massacres happening there. There was one in the town of Ocoee, Florida. There was one in the town of Rosewood, Florida, and just a bunch of other smaller lynchings and stuff like that. Like Florida has always just been a dumpster fire, but like so much of a dumpster fire that you don't even realize that a lot of it was racially motivated. Anyway, it's just a wild story. Anyway, our final story here happened on December 17th, 1979, when 33-year-old Arthur McDuffie led police on an 8-minute high-speed chase through the residential streets of Miami, Florida, at over 80 miles per hour on his Kawasaki Z1 motorcycle. According to the police report, and there's a reason I say according to the police report, the group of 6 officers in pursuit watched McDuffie lose control of his bike while making a sharp left turn, and he fell off, smacking his head on the ground. Although he tried to escape on foot, the officers then wrestled him to the ground, where he attempted to fight back. McDuffie was eventually subdued and taken to the hospital for his injuries because he fell off his motorcycle. Wink, wink. He died 4 days later. Following the autopsy, Dr. Ronald Wright said that it was basically impossible that McDuffie had died from injuries from falling off of his bike, and it was almost a certainty that he died because he was beaten to death. And here we go. Oh, I feel some of your buttholes pucker, and then I felt some of you be like, yeah, duh, we heard that coming all the time because police just beat everybody. This is great. I love creating these scenarios in my head in which fake listeners of this show are at odds with the things that I am saying. And I like to imagine a world where some of you are in your car and you're very angry with me. Maybe not with me personally, but you're like, oh, man, back to blue, man. Oh, support the police. And then some of you are in there like, yeah, ACAB. Police suck. Defund them. Of course they beat a black guy to death. That's what they do. It's great being in the middle of this and just telling stories. Obviously, like, he was beaten to death. That's just indisputable at this point. 9 days later, Officer Charles Viverka made a sworn statement that he had lied on the initial police report and that there actually hadn't been any sort of high-speed chase at all. Some of you probably just assumed that the high-speed chase part was real. That's how bad the narrative around police brutality is in this. You guys didn't think for 1 second that a police chase wasn't part of it. You probably just thought, oh yeah, they probably just, maybe he did crash and then that's how they caught up to him and then they beat him to death. But no, he actually didn't even crash his bike. What had actually happened was that Viverka had simply pulled McDuffie over for some unpaid traffic tickets and a suspended license. And here's the thing, guys, if you just pay your traffic tickets, even if you don't agree with them, if you just get your license renewed, then none of this would have happened. And I fully get that. I don't understand why people will just blatantly ignore paying traffic tickets. It's like, oh, I didn't do nothing. Just because they like disagree with it. Like, well, yeah, that's fine. You're allowed to disagree with it, but like rules is rules, right? Like you gotta be able to deal with those consequences. And boy, did Arthur McDuffie deal with those consequences. So basically what happened, Viverka pulled McDuffie over, tells him he's got some unpaid traffic tickets, suspended license. And then in the gentle and always amiable way that police handle things like this with black people, Viverka aggressively pulled McDuffie off the bike after he walked over to him and was like, you know why I pulled you over? McDuffie took offense to that and took a swing at Viverka, which you shouldn't have done, should not have done that. So then Viverka calls for backup. And because one police officer with a gun couldn't possibly win in a fight against an unarmed black man, within minutes, as many as 8 officers were on the scene beating McDuffie with their nightsticks and industrial flashlights. Just swarmed on him. As McDuffie lay on the pavement covered in blood, the officers then realized they had that moment of clarity like, oh, we went too far. And so instead of being like, we should really get this guy help, they decided to stage the entire scene to look like an accident. One officer ran over McDuffie's bike with his patrol car, which broke the gauges and made it look like McDuffie had crashed. Another officer threw McDuffie's watch in a gutter. Another officer scraped the pavement with a tire iron to simulate skid marks. Like, they really thought this through. All 8 of these officers were suspended, and Officer Alex Marrero, who had taken particular interest in bashing McDuffie's skull in with his flashlight, was charged with second-degree murder. The other 7 officers were given lesser offenses like manslaughter and tampering with evidence. In all, that particular group of officers had been cited 60 times between citizen complaints and internal probes since 1973. So, like, no one was super surprised that any of this even happened in the first place. During the trial for these officers, McDuffie was painted as an ex-Marine who doubled as a karate expert who, was this really nice guy. Oh, sure, he had some unpaid parking tickets, but like he was a patriot, and he was ready to defend himself and his country. But also, even though he was a trained killer and could like put anybody in a chokehold immediately, prosecutors did note that it should not have required 8 armed police officers to subdue him. On May 17th, 1980, all 8 officers were then acquitted by an all-white jury, because of course they were. What? I don't understand how you acquit all of these officers in this trial. Like, they have signed confessions that they staged the entire thing and that they beat this unarmed black man to death when they probably didn't need to. And they all get acquitted. And of course, all of the black people in Miami were upset. And there's probably quite a few of them down there. That night, 5,000 people protested at the downtown Miami Metro Justice Building, which of course quickly turned into a riot. 3 white men coming home from a day of fishing, just in the wrong place at the wrong time. They came across this mob and they were dragged from their car and beaten to death. A butcher in his shop was ambushed by another mob wasn't at his shop. He was in his car. They threw stones at his car as he drove past, causing him to panic and crashed into a wall. And this is so wild. The mob then converged on his car, his crashed car, set it on fire and trapped him inside and let him burn to death. Just wild. Absolutely wild. Despite over 3,500 National Guard troops in the area, the riots continued throughout various neighborhoods of Miami for the next 3 days. Governor Bob Graham eventually instituted a curfew and a temporary ban on alcohol and firearm sales, which actually did help end the riots. It's like, oh yeah, you're going to get people drunk and you're going to just let them go out and get a gun that day. It's probably not smart. However, in these riots, 18 people were killed, nearly 400 people were injured, and nearly 800 more were arrested. All right, some more race riots in the books. Unfortunate, but that's how it goes sometimes. Yeah, I don't know, man. Let's see what we learned today.
What did we learn?
I'm sure you've noticed, like sometimes when a story doesn't end on a particularly high note, I don't know how to transition out of that into like the what we learned segment. So that's, I mean, it's just, I don't know. Sometimes it's hard. It's hard being a podcast. I know I make it look so easy. It's hard doing these every week. So what did we learn today? Number one, Wilmington, North Carolina. Who knew? A site of one of the biggest racial riots in history. Just some angry white people were like, black people can't read. When have a newspaper, blah, blah, blah. And so they burned down the entire newspaper. They just attacking black people all willy-nilly and basically forced 2,100 black people to leave the city and go live somewhere else. Number two, it's always on continuing to that point. Don't get so caught up in the racial aspect of a situation. All right. Just because something happens to someone whose skin is a different color doesn't mean that was the reason why it happened. It's very easy to immediately turn to that because that's the most obvious thing you see right up front. Oh, that person looks different than me. That's obviously the problem. It's not. It's almost always socioeconomic status. It is the wealthy elites, the Illuminati elite. It's just the wealthy elites making sure that they can keep the poor down and controlled. And even better, if they can pit one side of the poor against another side of the poor and just let them fight and argue it out, all the better. So let's just not do that. All right, cool. And then number three, Arthur McDuffie was beaten to death by Miami police officers for no real reason. And they got acquitted for it because, of course, they would. Next week on Our Weird World, I can't believe it's taken over 200 episodes to have this as a topic. We are looking at stories from North Carolina. Maybe some of you who are listening to this don't live in North Carolina. Well, guess what? This show emanates from North Carolina. I was born and raised here. This is my state. It's not that bad. And so we're going to find some things about it that kind of are. So we are going to look at 4 stories from the state of North Carolina. We're going to look at the stories of Archie Kinsalls, Alma Petty Gatlin, Tom Dula, and Leon Holloman. So if you like North Carolina history, then this episode is for you. I know we're popular. Like, I know we got a bunch of California listeners, oddly popular in some places around the world, but North Carolina, you get to learn about it a little bit more next week. So thank you for continuing to listen. Keep telling all your friends and keep it weird.